Hi, I'm former Arby's trainee Alex Fraioli. Numbers. We all love them. 28? The rest? I've been a JRPG fan for as long as I've been playing video games, but both the genre and myself have grown a lot since the 80s. The original Dragon Quest was a pioneer that combined Western combat design with Japanese sensibilities. It had a basic, straightforward story, but it kept child me plenty entertained. As time went on, Japanese developers started to get bolder and more creative when it came to designing role-playing games. For me, the genre hit its stride in the 16 and 32-bit eras, when pixel art started coming into its own and scenario writers like Yoshitaka Murayama, Tetsuya Takahashi, and Yasumi Matsuno started exploring more profound, intricate human stories. It's a cozy kind of game, and when I heard that indie developers were looking to these classics for inspiration, I got excited. But it turns out that we have differing ideas about what inspiration means. I'm going to be discussing the love letter elements and critiquing the writing in two recent indie darling RPGs, Chained Echoes and Sea of Stars, so expect full spoilers for each. Most of this will center on their approaches to storytelling, though a fair bit of attention will also be paid to Homage and how both games approach and rely on it. A good plot may be subjective, but I've played enough of these things to pick up on the nuances of good storytelling. My aim for this video is to hopefully provide helpful advice to anybody thinking about creating their own RPG. This includes me. I've been working on the story for one for years, and playing these two games was an eye-opening experience that caused me to reconsider my approach. This is, above all, an opinion piece, and not everyone is going to agree with me on all of these points. That being said, there's nothing wrong with enjoying these games. I mostly did. On paper, someone like me should eat these games up. They are, after all, touted as love letters to the classics, expressions of deep admiration for the games that impacted me most as a young child and teenager. And in almost every regard, these games succeed. They are undeniably beautiful. The amount of work and polish that went into the sprite art, animation, and soundtracks of both games is extraordinary. And this polish isn't lost on consumers. These games have already pulled in millions in net sales. Aesthetically speaking, they would not feel out of place sitting among the other great works of the turn-based pantheon, and for this, their developers should be proud. Before we get into it, I want to emphasize that I don't make it a habit of picking on indie devs. Game development is incredibly stressful and often a labor of love. In many ways, Matthias and Sabotage deserve their success. But it's that same success that made these games' shortcomings stick out. I feel that it's cruel and unfair to hold small projects to the same standards as humongous commercial endeavors, but once you start making millions of dollars, you're fair game for criticism. Chained Echoes is a 2022 indie RPG produced mostly by Matthias Linda, after a successful Kickstarter campaign in 2019 that more than doubled its original goal of €60,000. Additional funding was pulled in through direct donations, allowing Matthias to include more stretch goals from the Kickstarter. Matthias himself drew and animated every one of the game's gorgeous sprites, with the exception of a few larger backdrops. He also conceived and wrote the entire story by himself, in addition to designing the game's various systems, including its excellent battle system. The game's outstanding soundtrack and sound design were by Eddie Marianakro, a talented composer and musician, who, in addition to his video game work, has scored commercials, short films, and solo albums. Gameplay-wise, Chained Echoes does a lot of things I like. Your party regain all their HP and MP after battles, so you're encouraged to use spells and abilities. Battles themselves use a unique overdrive system that requires carefully balancing the use of these abilities. Likewise, each boss encounter starts you off with a full ultra move gauge, allowing you to use these powerful attacks in tougher random battles without worrying about having to conserve them. Movement speed is fast, and when you go out of your way to explore, there's usually a treasure chest waiting for you. It's well designed and polished. But there's something about Chained Echoes I found distracting. The game contains a barrage of references to classic JRPGs, from names to places to archetypes to plot contrivances. Part of it is subtle, most of it unmistakable, and some of it possibly unintended, but we'll get to that later. Matthias has designed a game that insists, loudly and frequently, that you know how much he loves other games. The "hey, remember this" approach to game design is not my favorite, but as an RPG, the basic framework of the game is solid. In addition to a great battle system, it's got lots of areas to explore, treasure to find, weapons to upgrade, and optional monsters and bosses to hunt. From a narrative perspective, it was much more engaging than Sea of Stars. If you can look past the pervasive and obnoxious love letter fabric of the game, you might have fun with it. Of course, it can be argued that some of the examples I'm about to show you may not be deliberate references, but when they're shoulder to shoulder with things that definitely are, they tend to stick out. We are hardwired for constant pattern recognition. It's an evolutionary trait that can be tricky to turn off. Our rational brains may be willing to chalk these things up to coincidence for the sake of the story the first few times it happens. Let me show you what I mean. Some of these are going to seem silly and superficial, but hang in there. Do you like Chrono Trigger? Of course you do! How about that classic item glint? How about the excitement of the Millennial Fair with all its minigames? How about interrupting official proceedings by bursting dramatically through a stained glass window? Remember Glenn, the reluctant swordsman? Refrigerators! In sword times? How about a boss that changes the background? How about a boss that eats dreams? How about a humongous flying ship where our characters find themselves captured and without their equipment? Remember the three gurus? Honestly, between Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, and Evangelion, this is a triple reference. There's no way Matthias could pass it up. Remember those floating islands connected by chains? Remember when this enemy move was a track name on the Chrono Trigger OST? Remember when the princess told the guards to stand down and not arrest her friend? And then she questioned their loyalty? Remember Chrono's bedroom? Do you like Final Fantasy? Matthias sure the shit does. All your favorites are here. The legally distinct Crimson Wings. Reference to Leviathan. Is that a black chocobo and a black mage hat? Cool, I remember Neo X-Death. Remember how FF6 introduced characters? Remember an ancient being trapped in ice that was recently discovered? Remember Gao's diving helmet? Remember meeting this hired mercenary at the pub? How about fighting a boss on a moving minecart? Cool, a sunken civilization of magic users. Oh, remember the town of Miranda? Hey, is that Edgar? Well, almost. Remember the banquet and how the game checked your comprehension with questions to reward you with items afterwards? Remember splitting up into 3 groups? Remember a world-shaking calamity and then getting the crew back together? Remember going inside a giant sandworm to recruit an optional character? Remember the live stream? Remember when our protagonist freaked out and went comatose so we went into his mind? Remember these big beasts sent by the planet to protect it? It's not a gunblade, Mom, it's a gun spear. Remember the all-female guard faction led by a captain who always covered one eye? Overdrive! I didn't even clock that this was an intentional nod to FF10 until Matthias mentioned it during an interview. A bard ability called Valor Minuet. Not Raugrim. A very familiar sea monk monster. Roland Fields. Leaping Lizzie, is that you? This one also snuck by me, but was confirmed by Matthias. Okay, I need to take a breath before we do FF12, because I still believe that early in development, this game started as an FF12 demake. Distinctly shaped blue crystals with floating particles. The game opens in a big bustling city not unlike Rabanastre. The Blue Dawn, like the Dusk Shard, is stolen from the palace treasury after sneaking up through the sewers in the beginning of the game. Nebralia is awfully close to Nebradia. Gandabranth is comically close to Gabranth. This is just a Sikh. This is just a Bonga. And this green one in particular has a name that starts with Ba apostrophe. A very familiar Demon Wall boss inside a monarch's tomb. A resistance leader called Amalia who is also a princess. The first incarnation of the protagonist is named Vaughn. An adventurer's guild that sends you after special bounties or marks, some of which have specific spawn conditions. Arcadia! But don't worry, theirs is spelled without an H.
Ours goes Arcadia. Theirs goes Arcadia. It's not the same.
The reward board looks awfully similar to the license grid. Selling loot you find unlocks special deals. An entire low-town society where the lower class lives and conducts business. A big mossy forest dragon with a spore attack. 12 glyphs on the floor that kinda look like zodiac signs. A tower that, for some reason, shares a name with Ash's dad, King Ramanas. The Inquisitors are just judges. In fact, the entire character of Sienna is just Balthier, a former Inquisitor who dipped out for personal reasons and became a sky pirate. And just like Balthier, she's after the shard in the palace treasury at the beginning of the game. The Grand Grimoire MacGuffin is treated not unlike the Dawn, Dusk, and Midlight Shards, a weaponized stone that absorbs power. This stone was even created by a mysterious council of extra-dimensional beings who look down on humanity. Don't worry, there's plenty more to borrow from Ivalice. An ability called Leg Aim. A blonde classist noble prick who thinks of commoners as animals. A commoner who hates this unjust class-based society and thinks kidnapping the princess is gonna fix it. Hey, he also shows up later wearing a suit of armor. A mech called Ovelia. That's the name of that princess. Quick side note about these other mech frames. I know Paris and Agamemnon are from the Iliad and Merlin is from Arthurian legend, but Paris and Merlin are also generic unit names in, you guessed it, Final Fantasy Tactics. Victor's character art on the cover looks a lot like TG Sid. Another holy stone that gives you incredible power. As a fellow FF14 fan, more than a few things stuck out to me. Mysterious villains who speak in red text. Egil and his home of Shambhala bear no small resemblance to the Vanu Vanu in the Sea of Clouds. A fantasy pope who ends up dead. I have to admit, Chained Echoes did it better. Your lizard man just one-shots the pope in a hallway. Here's the clip from when I saw this for the first time on stream. Those are my friends. Oh god! Lizard man just fucking bodied the pope! Holy shit! That's really great. A post-game boss called Rando Mage that looks and functions exactly like 14's iteration of the Red Mage job class. The shade inhabitants of an ancient city who wield creation magics and speak to you as if they're still alive are lifted straight out of Amarot. Having Ether do the heavy lifting when a plot contrivance requires explanation. As Matthias' favorite RPG of all time, it's no surprise that a bunch of stuff from Xenogears shows up, opening the game with Alpha and Omega. Mechs powered by an ancient technology that no one understands anymore. Though referred to as Sky Armors, Matthias does slip up at least once and calls them gears. The past lives and reincarnations of our two main characters, one of whom is a woman also known as the Holy Mother. A mysterious mech user who shows up and seems to have allegiance to no one. A gun user in blue. A white-haired girl in blue who loses the power of speech through trauma but eventually talks again for dramatic effect. The very common name Bartholomew. A manipulative church created to control the surface dwellers. Golgotha's awfully similar to Golgotha. We shall be as gods! You sure will. The Suikoden influences aren't so in your face. You've got a home base, you recruit people to your cause, you get a bath, a blacksmith, an item shop, and a gathering hall. Perhaps the most noticeable thing borrowed from Suikoden 2 is the way both games open, on the eve of a long-awaited peace, shattered by a war-hungry nation that stages a false flag attack in order to perpetuate the conflict. And these were just the ones I caught. I've never played Terranigma, Legend of Dragoon, or Trials of Mana, which Matthias also cites as inspiration in addition to the ones already mentioned. I counted 2 possible Dragon Quest references, the Terran general Erlina and a castle overgrown with thorns, but honestly, these are almost certainly coincidence because I don't think it's possible for Matthias to only make 2 references to something. In a Reddit AMA, Matthias mentioned that his number 2 influence after video games is anime, and there's evidence of that all over the place too. The Evangelion stuff is hard to miss, but seeing as I haven't kept up with anime in the past 20 years, I didn't focus too closely on it, so there's probably a bunch of stuff there I missed as well. Homage itself is fine, but how much is too much? Art is subjective, and not everyone is going to agree on what kinds of usage are welcome or not. Homage in particular is all about purpose. I spoke with local film scholar Tom Bannerman, who defined homage as stealing, but French. Tom pointed to the popular Akira bike slide as an overdone type of homage that is rarely used in a transformative way, and most often used to say, "Hey, remember Akira?" That's the difference. Are you taking an element and reproducing it solely for the purpose of memberberry horseshit? Or are you using it in a meaningful way to say or do something new? This doesn't have to be a high bar. A game like Hi-Fi Rush making a Xenogears reference is so out of left field that I think it's genius. It works because it's specific yet unexpected. Confining homage to its own genre or style just makes it feel stale. And as a creative approach, I find it bland and pandering. In fairness, Matthias does take a small handful of these references and use them in creative ways. The minecart boss, for example, isn't just a retread of the one from FF6. It requires you to direct your cart onto other paths to collect bonuses or avoid damage, or even instant death. It seemed like a fresh idea to me that added an extra dimension to the fight, and I wouldn't have minded seeing another boss like it. It's innovative, but it's over pretty quickly. Moments like this felt rare in Chained Echoes. Perhaps the most meaningful thing about the game was Glenn's arc, and the idea that we need not be defined by our failures, which spoke to me as a recovered alcoholic. This also subverts the reincarnation angle, as we come to learn that this original version of Glenn was not the kind-hearted Timothy that the game initially suggests, but in fact the self-centered ass who wanted Timothy's girlfriend. But used clumsily, Homage can distract from the overall experience, and I felt this almost immediately with Chained Echoes' incessant nods and references. The game even opens exactly like Chrono Trigger, in Chrono's bedroom. Sometimes I had trouble figuring out where Homage was meant to end and the game's actual characters and story were meant to begin. Leaning heavily on reference often only serves to remind the player of other games that were written, designed, and executed much better. It's great to be inspired, but the more you wear it on your sleeve, the more you distract from the original work you did do. And when you do that, it can give the player the sense that maybe you don't really have confidence in your own ideas. Now, I know there were more than a few of those examples that made you sit up and say, Alex, hang on. FF4 didn't invent Leviathan. FF12 didn't invent Arcadia. It's likely that Chrono Trigger didn't invent refrigerators. You're right, these things have been around. Arcadia as a name and utopian concept has been a popular subject since antiquity. In fact, while writing this script, I was watching the Final Fantasy XIV FanFest livestream in which Yoshi P announced the new raid series for 7.0, entitled Arcadia. In Japanese anyway. The katakana don't lie. But you're right, some of these may not be deliberate illusions. Coincidences, taken alone, don't mean much. But they're not alone, is the thing. George Lucas didn't invent the names Luke and Han, but if I'm invited to someone's house and she says, "These are my dogs, Luke and Han," what conclusion does your brain jump to? I guess it could be coincidence. Maybe she named Luke after her grandfather and later adopted Han, who had already been named. But what if she's also got a Lego Millennium Falcon on her mantle and a Darth Vader Christmas tree topper? Suddenly, the odds of those things being a coincidence drastic go down. Look at Lady Reyna, for example. The Tomb of Lady Reyna is an important location in the lore of the game that our party hunts for in Act 3. Reyna is Spanish for queen, and since the character was a princess in life, that's a fitting enough name. But dropping this name in a Squaresoft Fanatics passion project can point the mind in a specific direction. The Final Fantasy anthology translation of Lena's name in FF5, Reyna. Was this name chosen to deliberately reference the FFA version of FF5, the first official release of the game outside of Japan? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that it appears nestled among dozens of other blatant and spotlit FF references shoves that notion to the front of my mind. Even when something isn't intentional, it can still feel distracting given the context, and it's something that writers should be mindful of. I make these comparisons to draw attention to the absurdity of their sheer volume. I'm not saying don't use the name Reyna, I'm saying maybe only steal 10 things from Final Fantasy instead of 100. There's a character called Reyna in Tekken 8. Seeing her name in Tekken 8 doesn't remind me of FF5. You know why? Because she's in Tekken 8. If you're crafting a wholly original story, world, and characters, great, commit to it. If you're going to borrow names, plot devices, and other elements wholesale, at the very least try to use them in productive or meaningful ways. Stop hiding low-effort writing under the banner of Homage. I don't want to play a checklist of things you like, regardless of whether or not their inclusion was intentional. See, I don't think that all of the references I listed were conscious choices made by Matthias. Judging by his Reddit AMAs, he has a habit of borrowing without realizing it. A couple of fans politely called him out on Rob's similarities to Algus and these big, bulky grappler enemies called Baki. His response to both was essentially, "Oh, did I? Lol." That doesn't seem like a great answer coming from someone who fancies himself a writer. Self-awareness is a valuable trait, especially when it comes to folding other people's work into your own. Reference and homage themselves aren't universally bad things. They're a part of something called intertextuality, the idea that creative works acknowledge the ones that came before, either subtly or overtly. When used sparingly, they can be powerful, thought-provoking, or just cute. But when these things just keep popping up, they dilute the world you were trying to paint. They are but one ingredient to be used sparingly. Matthias has lovingly but unwittingly created the cinnamon challenge of RPG references. In his promotion for the game, Matthias used every interview and promo piece to talk about how much he loves old RPGs, and how he wants to make a game that looks and feels exactly like them. Ironically, I think I would have enjoyed the game's story a lot more if I had never played Xenogears or the Ivalice games, because then most of the characters and plot would have been fresh to me. It is a love letter to those games, but whether or not it's worth spending $25 to read someone's sweaty letter is ultimately up to you. I am willing to admit that a lot of this just comes down to personal preference. I might just be a little too sensitive to this kind of thing. I have trouble understanding this approach to game design. To me, it's the world-building equivalent of jingling keys in front of a dog. On the other hand, many people seem to like referential content. It's often praised when fans talk about the game, and I'm not going to tell them not to have fun. Let's chalk that all up to personal preference. Homage aside, Chained Echoes has another problem. Though not necessarily a symptom of its love letter nature, the writing in Chained Echoes is all over the place, both structurally and mechanically. It is the game's weakest link by a wide margin, placing a heavier burden on its other elements. Chained Echoes' script needed another pass. The game suffers from a common tell-don't-show problem. Even the very beginning of the game opens with a lengthy lore dump in the form of several paragraphs peppered with names, places, and events that you'd better memorize.
I've sold monorails to
Terran, Gravos, Escania.
And by gum, it put them on the map.
I suppose this is more of a dig at the games that inspired Matthias. FF12 and Xenogears in particular both open with this kind of dry exposition that I feel is a little excessive. Setting the stage with some backstory is fine, but I feel that it's easier for the audience to swallow dozens of fantasy names when they're intercut with character moments and interesting events. Here's one Matthias and I both like, Suikoden 2. The game opens in the Highland Army Unicorn Youth Brigade encampment, on the eve of a peace treaty that is about to be cancelled as the evil Prince Luca Blight stages an attack and cuts down his own men. Prominent people and factions are introduced as a natural course of conversation. After our heroes flee the slaughter, we're treated to a melancholy intro scene which tells us, without a single word of dialogue or exposition, that these two boys grew up, trained, and joined the military together. We see family members, old and young, as well as hints of the importance of this nation's military might. Suikoden 2 is also a game rich with diplomacy and political intrigue, yet it manages to establish these concepts without grinding to a halt to tell us who Highland, Joustin, Muse, Greenhill, Matilda, etc. are. Each act of Chained Echoes also ends with a wall of text, which I at first thought modeled after FF12's framing device, the memoirs of Marquis Ondor. But by the end of the game, I started to suspect that this may have been a confused nod to Disc 2 of Xenogears, which infamously reduced entire dungeons and plot points to blocks of text describing the exploits of the party because the game was behind schedule and had to be shipped. Matthias unwittingly imitates this by glossing over what seem like substantial events, like rebel forces led by your group liberating 2 kingdoms, including the one led by our antagonist, Frederick. Matthias put a lot of work into the lore of his world, but unfortunately a majority of this information is hastily dumped on the player at regular intervals. This guy at the banquet drops 10 proper nouns across a handful of text boxes, clumsily explained for the player's benefit. How do we know he's not saying this for the character's benefit? Because the game just had a scene establishing that Victor is over 500 years old. There's no way he doesn't know this information. We'll dive into Sea of Stars proper later, but it's interesting to note that when it comes to dispensing lore, the way both games tackle bookshelves encapsulates their respective approaches. Too much, and not enough. Info dumping is a common mistake, but I understand the intent. The author wants you to know all the key players, events, locales, and lore of their world, but hasn't quite figured out how to dole all of this information out in manageable, organic ways. An unwelcome byproduct of this attitude is the game's tendency to handhold or over-explain things that are best left to the player's imagination. Act 2 starts with a girl in a mysterious temple. Her face looks a lot like Lens, a character in our party, which I thought was a great way to start nudging the player towards the game's reincarnation angle. Then Len wakes up. Without a word, the player has probably guessed that they just witnessed a vision she saw in her dreams. That dream again. Was it my echo from a past life? Well, I guess it was. You know, I was kind of savoring the mystery of that sequence until you spelled it out for me. Another example of this shows up soon after the events on the Aurora, in a conversation with Sienna back at your home base. Have you noticed that Rob isn't insulting us as often as before? Yes, I think it's because he exhibited a raw moment of vulnerability back on the Aurora when he begged for our help to help rescue Len from the— It started when we agreed to help him rescue Len from the Aurora! I was there, Sienna! This was 10 minutes ago! The plot is heavy with mysterious goings-on and political intrigue, but it leans a little too heavily on rumors to deliver this information to the player. So the rumors are true! But if the rumors are true— Do you think the rumors are true? So the rumors are true after all! I think most of them have already heard the rumors, so the rumors are true. I bet it's about the rumors. Oh yeah, I've heard the rumors. A fire? Then the rumors were true that the townsfolk don't want the Chancellor to trust Terran because the Prince only instigated the peace treaty to recover and bide his time until they can reignite the war. Buddy, that's a lot to infer from a fire. We need to talk about the protagonist, Glenn. Glenn is kind of an idiot. In Act 1, all of his friends ask to be rewarded in gold for returning the princess to the kingdom that is brazenly manufacturing a fresh war. But our plucky young protagonist instead says, "Well, gosh, no gold for me, thanks. I just want to know all about your nuclear program." Then has the audacity to pull shocked Pikachu face when soldiers show up to murder him and all his friends. Later on, after he steals Terran's super weapon directly from their battleship, "Why is Terran shooting at me? How are you this dumb?" He fights like a madman. Okay, this has been bugging me the whole game. Does he though? Glenn is, from the outset of Chained Echoes, made out to be a butt-kicking crackerjack ace sky armor pilot. Perhaps the greatest of all time. Except he's not. He's got the same stats and abilities as everyone else. Even cutscenes don't show him doing anything highly skilled or otherwise impressive in his piloting. You know how FF6 makes a big deal out of Terra being able to use magic? And how it backs that up by having the character learn magic naturally. Or even gives her extra abilities when she's riding Magitech armor. If you're writing a character who's supposed to have some sort of extraordinary power or ability, I'm gonna need a little more to go on than "the script said so." Len doesn't seem like the sharpest tack either. Remember when she ordered her countrymen to stand down so we could escape from the city? That gets undone almost immediately when she turns in herself and the entire party. Glenn says we can fight our way out, and as the player, I agreed with him, but Len doesn't want to hurt Terran's soldiers, so she gives up and turns herself in. That way, no one gets hurt and everyone's fine and nothing bad will happen except it immediately does. Wait, about my friends. Yeah, they're out on the wing about to be executed. Even Sienna, that wasn't the deal. No one mentioned a deal. Why would you think there was ever a deal? All General Guston promised is that he wouldn't kill your friends right here and now. It's like the characters aren't watching the same events unfold that the player is. Her whole Valkyrie thing was jarring. Our hero Glenn is fleeing the enemy with the MacGuffin when he is set upon by a squad of elite anti-mech Valkyries. Amid this chaos, Len finds the time to step to the stern of the airship and calmly say, "The commander of the Valkyries is traditionally the highest-ranking female member of the royal house. In other words, me." And my first thought was, oh well, I guess this actually fits her character, this is smart. Len wants to avoid killing wherever possible, and in this case she can use her rank to order the Valkyries to stop attacking Glenn. Nope, no, okay, no, she's killing them. These Valkyries are introduced and exist here solely so that Len can one-shot them. Her character reluctantly came to terms with the need for taking human lives 5 minutes ago. How seriously was she wrestling with the issue? I think the point the dialogue meant to convey was that Len herself is a practiced Valkyrie and can use those skills to counter the ones attacking Glenn. But putting the focus on her rank rather than her ability is poor wording and makes her murder spree confusing. Rank is irrelevant. She's a princess. She was born into rank. Quick sidebar, this is not strictly related to the writing, but it did affect how many scenes played out for me. In a game full of beautiful sprite art, Glenn's portrait is dull. The hero of our game is stuck with this vapid milquetoast mug for the entire thing, regardless of what's going on with the guy emotionally. It's really my only visual complaint in an otherwise good-looking game. The other characters show a hint of personality. Len's got that little Mona Lisa smile thing going on. Victor wears a smirk, ready with a joke or a piece of advice. Even Rob looks like the prick that he is. But Glenn is just... Mwah. He's supposed to be the emotional linchpin in many scenes, but this is a hard sell when you always look like you forgot it was school picture day. A lot of the dialogue is off. There is a way to use swearing, and this isn't it. Scenes that are meant to be dramatic read as childish. The darned thief touched the stone. Ancient demigods, thank you for watching your language. Okay, look, humor is subjective, and Matthias was very upfront in his promotion of the game in regards to its awful joke content. It's mostly inoffensive groaners, but what's with this plot armor? The term plot armor is a tongue-in-cheek descriptor used by many fandoms to explain why characters crucial to a story don't end up injured or killed following events in which they likely would be. But this isn't a secret item that makes the wearer invincible, nor does it have anything to do with the plot. It's just a regular piece of armor that you find in a dungeon. There's several of them, in fact. It's not even the best armor. What's the joke? On top of all that, the game is plagued by basic errors in wording or punctuation that suggest it was never proofread. My wife literally eats all of your work. I believe this is called xylophagia. So you really want to hand me a helping paw? You mean a helping hoof? Aren't you a pig? Missing comma, missing comma, missing comma. Two plural, not plural enough. Missing apostrophe, extra apostrophe? Len owns people apparently. All right. Out of place reference to a trademarked product. Weird laughs. There's plenty of awkward phrasing in most scenes, many of which I had to read twice. This one's my favorite, in which Glenn refers to ridding himself of this accursed MacGuffin as closing the deal. Good news, honey. I closed the deal with the Grimoire today. The character of Amalia mentions her poor wording. So what's everyone else's excuse? This scene is meant to show how Amalia, an awkward 14-year-old, struggles to speak and relate to others. But her wording is just as bad as everyone else's. I didn't know that she in particular was meant to have trouble formulating sentences until she turned to the camera and told me. I'm sure it would reassure the character to know that she fits in just fine. It's surprising that someone can borrow so much from Final Fantasy XII and not notice how much care and attention was given to the script and dialogue. The poor writing actually backs up into a kind of accidental nostalgia, because it sometimes feels like the writing in older RPGs, back when translation and proofreading just weren't priorities. It's important to mention here that Matthias is German and not a native English speaker. Initially, I tried to be lenient with the writing for this reason, until something in the credits caught my eye. An English localizer is credited. Matthias wrote the script in English, so I think the term he's looking for is editor, but semantics aside, who is it? Well, it's the composer, Eddie Marianakro. The guy who meticulously composed 50 original tracks for the game over 4 years was also tasked with sifting through hundreds of pages of fantasy writing. Eddie has mentioned playtesting the game, but this is not the same as combing through a script line by line to ensure cohesion and native-sounding dialogue. This is ideally a separate job for a dedicated person. I reached out to Eddie while making this video, and he was kind enough to give me a response. So, about the localization aspect. I'm not a professional localizer. Composing is my main job. However, because indie games have such a limited budget, I took up the task of looking through the English text and trying to help out where I could. It seems that Eddie was asked by Matthias to look over the script as a native English speaker, a responsibility that Eddie admits he wasn't really trained for. Matthias then sticks Eddie's name in the credits, either not knowing or not caring that he volunteered the poor guy to do a professional editor's job. Eddie had just finished scoring an entire game, quite well I might add, and believed in the project so much that he agreed to help out with this aspect of development as well, despite not having the training for it. And he's right, indie devs do typically run into budget constraints, especially on their first game. The game's crowdfunding sits at €163,222. After meeting its original goal of $60,000, stretch goals were met for extra characters, minigames, post-game content, German, French, and Japanese localizations, New Game Plus, PS4 and Switch ports, physical copies, and miscellaneous extras and touch-ups, like an extended bestiary, icons, and portraits. You couldn't toss a few grand to a professional to proofread the magnum opus love letter you've been working on for 7 years, despite writing it in a language not your own, in a notoriously text-heavy genre? But I know it's not always that simple. Game development is expensive, and costs often get out of hand. It's reasonable to believe that all of those stretch goals needed every last euro and then some to become reality. My theory is that this was simply an initial oversight that was then compounded by poor management on Matthias's part, who realized too late into development that he had overestimated his own writing ability. It's not uncommon for members of a small team to wear multiple hats, but copy editing an entire RPG script isn't something you should pawn off on the composer. So what about hiring a copy editor with profits from the game's sales? The net revenue from Steam alone is over $1 million at the time of this recording. And I know this doesn't account for other costs and contributors to the project that Matthias may have yet to compensate, but you're also telling me there's not a couple bucks left over from this to give your script the proper treatment it deserves? When asked during an AMA if he had plans, now that the game is out and successful, to go back and clean up the script, Matthias replied with, "No plans. Surely there is room for improvement, and the quality isn't consistent throughout the game, so getting help in that regard is something I will do with the next game. So, even if not perfect, I think it's fine as it is." This attitude is disappointing, but I get it. Matthias is exhausted after getting Chained Echoes out and wants to focus on his next project. And he acknowledges that his first game missed the mark a bit in terms of writing and that it's something to improve in his next one. I think if he hires a dedicated writer or editor, his next game has a chance to be incredible. Towards the end of Chained Echoes, I started to disagree with some characters' actions. The ending specifically involves our hero Glenn forgiving serial traitor Killian and giving him another chance at life in exchange for Glenn's. I didn't like Killian as a character, at all, and this decision made me angry at Glenn. But the fact that I even had opinions about where I wanted the plot to go meant I was invested in it. It meant that for all its mistakes and clumsiness, I was still engaged with these characters, and had thoughts and opinions about where I wanted them to go. Because here's the thing, Chained Echoes is poorly written, but it understands the basics of storytelling.
And the Game Award goes to Sea of Stars. Congrats, Sabotage.
I didn't put that music behind it. That is not award music. That is Our Galleon is About to Be Boarded music. Sea of Stars is a 2023 indie RPG by Sabotage Studios, who also developed 2018's retro-style action platformer The Messenger. I checked out the demo when it dropped and was immediately impressed with the game's lush, detailed sprite work and animation. I'm not a big fan of Super Mario RPG-style timed hits, but I know enough to say that they're implemented well here. And the game even includes options to make them less severe for clumsy dorks like me. In terms of visual style and general feel, Sabotage was heavily inspired by Chrono Trigger, and it shows. Comparing Sea of Stars to Chrono Trigger isn't supposed to be a gotcha, this is how the game was pitched and funded. Sabotage said, "We're making modern Chrono Trigger," and everyone's money said, "You sure are." How is this any different from what Chained Echoes does? I think it's a question of focus. Sea of Stars is pointedly and deliberately aiming for that Chrono Trigger vibe. It knows exactly what it's aping. It's a Beatles cover band that plays Beatles music. Chained Echoes has more of a scattershot feel, as if to say, I'm not sure what I want to be, so here's a little bit of everything. Neither feels wholly original, but originality was never the point. Then I heard they got Yasunori Mitsuda as a guest composer. Okay, I guess. He's worked on some of the most famous soundtracks in the genre. It's obvious why they did this. Mitsuda scored Chrono Trigger, the game Sea of Stars is trying desperately to be. I got nothing against Mitsuda. He's a working artist and he deserves to get paid. But as an addition to Sea of Stars, he felt more like a trophy or accessory. Look what we got. Oh, you like that? That's a Mitsuda original. I was so into the music of Chrono Trigger that in 1997, I ordered what I thought was the OST out of the back of a magazine. This very one, in fact. But what I received instead was the acid jazz cover album Brink of Time, which it took me a while to warm up to, but when I did, it clicked hard with teenage me. I used to fall asleep in high school listening to the last track, a version of Too Far Away Times, wishing I could go on time travel adventures with my friends, then hang out with an old man under a lamppost. I still wish these things. One of the reasons we remember the soundtracks of our favorite games so fondly isn't just because they're beautiful pieces of music. It's because we take them in synergistically during gameplay while struggling with a difficult fight or processing a heavy scene. There's an emotional alchemy that takes place between the music and the gameplay that bonds these moments to our hearts and minds. It produces an associative sensation that is more than just the sum of its parts. I would describe Sea of Stars music as a good soundtrack wasted. Well-written music shines against the backdrop of a well-written story. When there's nothing in the story or characters with which to synergize, the emotional ceiling for a given track stays pretty low. And without a story or characters to match his level, Mitsuda's output here never truly gets a chance to shine beyond those limits. As a result, Sea of Stars feels exactly like the sum of its parts. Because video games are themselves ensemble performances. On the game's website, Sabotage says, Mitsuda represents exactly what Sea of Stars needed to feel truly whole. Does he, though? Similar to Chained Echoes, Sea of Stars grapples with a few fundamental problems in its writing. But aside from a few difficult-to-parse sentences, punctuation errors, and a lot of missing commas, the mechanical side of things is mostly there. Although I'm unsure why characters talk about sewing and are then shown weaving. I have some friends who will remind you emphatically that these are very different things. All things considered, these kinds of gaffes aren't that bad. It's nowhere near the mangled mess of Chained Echoes, and honestly, these mistakes seemed to become less frequent as the game went on. But the real problem lies in the content of the writing itself. Similar to Chained Echoes, Sea of Stars has a clumsy sense of humor that I don't personally enjoy. Again, I know humor is subjective, and there are plenty of people who like this sort of thing, but for the sake of this section, let's make it very clear that I do not. The difference between the two games is that while Matthias knew to get out of his own way when writing important dialogue, Sea of Stars instead leans into a pervasive, quirky, self-aware style that doesn't necessarily suit every scene in which it's used. The game sometimes has trouble pinning down tone, choosing to double down on half-baked jokes and fourth wall breaking, instead of being clear, concise, or otherwise working towards the spirit of what a particular scene is meant to convey in the service of the plot. When the party arrives at the port town of Brisk, we're introduced to Captain Cliché and her band of pirates. One of the pirates, Yolande, introduces her cohorts and then spouts off a list of RPG cliches that she says they've had to deal with in their travels, as both player and party stare blankly at them. This happens a couple more times before being dropped by the game entirely, and each time I found it awkward and distracting. The captain, the one actually named Cliché, seems to have no interest in or knowledge of these tropes. Yolande is the one who keeps bringing them up. Why not name her Cliché? Why make us and the party squirm awkwardly as she interrupts our journey to channel a late 90s forum post? Similar attempts at self-aware humor often serve only to distract from the storytelling. To me, this was most noticeable in the town of Lucent, where our heroes rest before confronting a dweller, one of several abominations created by the Big Bad that have the potential to destroy the planet if left alone. This confrontation has been built up since the start of the game as a gravely serious matter. It's what our protagonists have been training for. We're on an island from which no one has ever returned, sent to fight what we think is the last great evil in the world. Yet the behavior of the innkeeper and villagers, mad though they are, still feels inappropriately precious. The tavern is called the first stage of grief, which, if you're familiar with Dabda, is denial. With all the subtlety of a gun, the game is telling you that the villagers are literally in denial, pretending that they don't live down the road from a flesh abomination. They share their delusions with you and encourage what they presume are the party's delusions in turn. Okay, fine, but execution matters. That night, the dweller suddenly possesses a villager from afar and drags them to its lair to their demise. The innkeeper's response to this is to get on stage and say, My, remember 10 seconds ago when absolutely nothing happened? It was so boring, a villager responds. I know what you're doing, but why are you doing it? In trying to be quirky and cute, the game shatters any tension that may have been building. Up to this point, the game hasn't said or done anything specific to establish the horrors that dwellers are capable of. All we know is that they are generically evil and dangerous. This is your first chance to show the player exactly what kind of a threat these things are, and illustrate the fear they can instill in regular people. Instead, we have a villager float away, and the townspeople respond with a wink-wink, nudge-nudge that sends mixed signals to the player. How do you want us to read this? The idea of a town in denial is fine, but in their attempts to be cute, the characters come off as hacky and tone-deaf, thereby nullifying any apprehension that may have been established. It's the same issue I had with the Messenger's overbearingly self-aware style of writing, but it's easier to ignore bad dialogue in an action game as opposed to a 30-hour RPG. Hey, Chrono Trigger's writing ain't perfect either. Show Us Your Stamp Collection, son was a clunker even in 1995. This was before localization got turned on its head by things like Vagrant Story, that finally brought video game writing up to the standard of the stories that Japanese developers were telling. But this isn't a localization. Somebody wrote this on purpose. If you've ever seen someone nervously give a presentation or perform amateur stand-up, you know how people can rush through things without giving the audience the proper time to process them. Even professionals can struggle with timing. Remember when MST3K came back on Netflix and there were too many rapid-fire riffs without a pause between them? Plot points and developments, like jokes, need time to breathe. This affects the stakes of the game, because Sea of Stars presents dilemmas and then solves them almost instantly. No problem ever feels lasting. No stakes ever feel real. It builds incredible atmosphere through its environments and music and then squanders it. Things that could have been dramatic or impactful get hastily wrapped up so we can move on to the next one. For example, early on, Garl gets possessed by the Dweller of Woe, which has been established as a death sentence. But it's okay, because Seraï shows up and knocks him out and says there's a thing called a Soul Stone, and it just so happens to be on this island. We had less than 60 seconds to give a shit. The port town of Brisk is destroyed, and is then almost immediately rebuilt. We came all this way, but the watchmaker won't help us. But then she immediately does. The release mechanism is broken. Don't worry, your new guy just had to jump on it. This portal we found is sending monsters out to other worlds, but if it's destroyed, it'll blow up the planet, unless it gets hit really fast, but not by us. Then an NPC from the previous dungeon shows up who can hit things really fast, hits it really fast, and leaves. A handful of the villains don't even survive long enough to say or do anything interesting. In the span of one dungeon, these 3 bird generals, called the Triumvirate of Eminence, are introduced and seem like they might be kinda cool, but then die almost immediately. Even the 2 bosses in the final dungeon leading up to the big bad show up just to die. Soul Curator does show up in a flashback before we meet him, but has no dialogue, and we are merely told how he is bad. Bosses with little to no backstory at all can still contribute to the storytelling if done correctly. Look at the 3 brutes leading up to Zoma in Dragon Quest III. Through naming alone, the player is given extra information about these bosses and their place in the wider world of the game. The first is the King Hydra that just slew the hero's father. The second is implied to be the spirit of the original villain Baramus, or perhaps his brother if you're playing in Japanese, while the third is implied to be his reanimated bones. Without saying a single word, each boss is given a presence of its own. Even the mangled NES translations hinted at a connection, enriching the experience in my 9-year-old brain. When you don't stop and take the time to let your scenes and characters breathe, you make it harder for the player to get absorbed in your world. I know that world building is difficult. Anyone who's ever GM'd a tabletop game knows how much effort it takes to fill an entire campaign with subtle yet plausible detail. Video games need this too. The reason that Sea of Stars pacing feels rushed is because the story elements that should be serving as foundational and connective tissue are instead buried behind Teaks. Teaks is the historian that the party meets shortly into the game. She is also, unfortunately, the game's primary lore dispensary. Major plot details are kept behind her stories, which are unlocked by trading her certain treasures you find throughout the game. Meaning that if you happen to miss a chest containing one, you're also missing out on a crucial chunk of the story or lore. These include the origins of the Great Serpent, the 3 sisters, and the 2 alchemists. Yes, the main villain's origins and motivation are buried behind optional story time. This is crucial information that should be organically woven into your world and narrative, not relegated to an optional NPC that hangs out around your campfire. A designated lore dump station neither builds a world nor tells a story. I finished the game not knowing why we went to the Sky Kingdom or who those giant people were supposed to be because the game rushes you from point to point like a nervous tour guide. Tossing key information behind a static NPC after the fact is a cop-out. You put effort into building and animating this world. Don't be afraid or ashamed to slow down and convey these details like a story would do. This is a writing quirk that bugs me in TV and movies as well, but a few too many scenes fade in mid-anecdote with a character saying something like, "Haha, you should have seen his face!" Sounds like something funny happened and you've got a relatable story about it. Sounds like it would have been a good opportunity to humanize and add depth to your characters. There's no reason for the player to be showing up late to cutscenes. In medias res dialogue is, of course, a common tool, but it's used primarily to add a sense of urgency or intrigue to a scene. Sea of Stars seems to use it as an emotional shortcut, as if to psych the player into thinking they witnessed something meaningful, without actually having to write it. Once or twice is fine, but given enough time, they all start to feel like the same mangled Chanel dress. Depicting inter-character relationships is something that Chained Echoes actually did pretty well, as shown in this scene between Rob and Killian, two characters who don't have much in common, arguing over the best way to prepare toad soup. Rob, a noble, prefers it clear, while Killian, a career mercenary, likes a little mud in the pot to affect an earthy flavor. On top of being good characterization, it shows that this previously prickly group is slowly starting to get along, to the point that they can have trivial discussions like this with each other. Sea of Stars doesn't quite understand how to go about this. The characters are friends because they get along. They get along because they are friends, and the player is expected to take all of this on faith. Sea of Stars' breakneck pace and lack of narrative details seem to be an unfortunate side effect of Sabotage's approach. In an NPR interview on the topic of classic RPGs, the game's creative director, Thierry Boulanger, said, "If the audience were to go back and actually replay those games, they might think less fondly of them. The idea for Sea of Stars was to remove that tedium and get players to feel like they're moving forward all the time." Armed with this perspective, the game does include several options to streamline elements of the experience for which modern players may not have the patience, which is something I do agree with. But in applying this philosophy to the game's story, Sabotage has inadvertently thrown the baby out with the bathwater and produced a gorgeous, finely polished aesthetic experience that prays you won't slow down long enough to notice that there's very little substance underneath it all. In the interest of speed, pesky things like character development, meaningful decisions, and satisfying arcs have indeed been streamlined straight off the game. Chrono Trigger was the second game after Final Fantasy VI to give me what I refer to as post-party depression. That melancholy feeling you get after spending an entire game with a lovable cast of characters who then have to go their own separate ways. Every character, save for perhaps our mute protagonist, endears themselves to the player in some way or another over the course of the game, and we watch their relationships and attitudes grow and change. Sea of Stars struggles with this balance. None of the characters have any real flaws or hobbies or foibles or dreams outside of saving the world and having a great day. As characters, they feel functionally incomplete. In fact, I'd say the only character who undergoes any kind of change is Headmaster Moraine, who renounces his faith and resigns partway through the game after the major betrayal. His relationship with the heroes changes a little, and he feels more like a peer than the stern authority figure he was in the beginning. It's a welcome dynamic that reminded me of running into my old teachers after I'd graduated and grown up, and seeing them as fellow adults for the first time. Unfortunately, this kind of development doesn't really exist in other characters. It would have been nice to see the relationship between the alchemists explored a bit more, but just as the game starts doing this, it ends. If you need a condensed and very basic video game introduction to character arcs, look at Persona's social links. They're divided into 10 easily digestible segments, with each one showing incremental change. We meet a new friend, get to know their interests, personalities, and problems, and ultimately find a way to help them overcome a roadblock in their growth. They're not all winners, but they all contain the bare minimum of an arc. For an example of raw characterization, I'll always point to Estinian, your Dragoon pal from the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV. What is it about this character that makes him memorable? Some would say his stoic Ishgardian spirit, or perhaps his fierce attitude on the front lines of battle. Maybe you like his stern but caring relationship with Alphino, and how proud he is to see the guy hold his own during the final days. Those are all great, but the thing that tied this character together for me was one tiny defect. He's bad with money. It was refreshing to see what I thought was a broad fantasy archetype become humanized thanks to a single flaw. This kind of characterization is endearing and relatable, and it's something Sea of Stars just isn't concerned with. In fact, the one and only time the cast felt cohesive and not just like a collection of cutouts to me was because of the sprite work. Everyone in the main cast has to change into formal attire to eat at an exclusive restaurant in an optional quest at the very end of the game. And for this scene, everyone was given unique outfits and character portraits. It was nice to see. Even if it was a one-off occurrence, for one brief moment these characters became slightly humanized. But let's run down the roster. Valere and Zale, our two main characters, are solstice warriors, with the former representing the moon and the latter representing the sun. They are very good friends with a character named Garl. There's not a lot else to say about them. Meanwhile, over in Chrono Trigger, let's look at Marl, a tomboy princess who's dissatisfied with the life that's been laid out for her, who runs away to have an adventurous afternoon at the Millennial Fair, and ends up with more than she bargained for. Marl is a dynamic character who adapts to the things going on around her. Bumping into Chrono, getting sent across time, getting stuck in the Phantom Realm. You learn a lot about a character by how they react to the events that are inflicted upon them. She grows and changes as a person over the course of the game, as we watch her pull away from and eventually grow closer to her father, who has different notions about how a princess should act, but ultimately loves his daughter and wants her to be happy on her own terms. She briefly knows what it's like to not exist, and with the rest of the party becomes privy to how the world will end. Through these experiences, she reveals herself to be stubborn but kind, aggressive but supportive. She serves as a bright, energetic foil to Luca's rationality, Robo's stoicism, Isla's brashness, and even Frog's despondence. Valere and Zale, in contrast, are born into a life of fighting evil. They seem pretty okay with it. At the end of the game, they defeat evil. I have nothing else to say about them because there is nothing else to say about them. I'm embarrassed to admit this, but when the game introduced the notion of the Solstice Warriors, an order that forces children to give up their childhoods to train for deadly battles, I thought that the name Zale might have been chosen in reference to the diamond reseller of the same name. On a whim, I looked up Valere, and turns out there's a luxury designer jewelry brand with her name as well. I thought the game might have been drawing a parallel to conflict diamonds and child labor to connote sympathy for these children who are never given a chance at a normal life. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I did this because early in the game, I was still under the impression that Sea of Stars was going to try to be as thoughtful as it was beautiful. As the game wore on, it became clear that it was uninterested in doing this, and that these names were chosen because... shiny. But that's the harsh reality of the game. It's Himbo Trigger. Seraï is a ninja from a world already in the clutches of the Fleshmancer. Somehow, she travels to Valere and Zale's world to get their help because the villain turned her people into cool cyborgs that can use portals. Her homeworld is modeled after Chrono Trigger's post-apocalyptic 2300 AD, and near as I can tell, the decision to have her people converted into cyborgs goes no deeper than, remember when Chrono Trigger fed humans into a machine too? Resh'an is the narrator who opens the game and chimes in after key events from his study in the Clockwork Tower, until he gets bored with this halfway through the game and joins the party. He is an immortal alchemist and ex-BFF of the antagonist Aphorol the Fleshmancer. I'm confused about the exact nature of Resh'an's strict code that stipulates how he's allowed to interact with certain people or things. I understand why the character has to be given limitations. He's an immortal demigod, and if he were to use his true power, it would trivialize the rest of the game. But in doing so, the game introduces contradictions that seem like more trouble than they're worth. When Resh'an first meets the party and agrees to help them, he is very careful to specify that he must follow a specific set of rules, for failing to do so would open up countless other worlds to the antagonist's wrath. He is very clear how seriously he takes this. He then gives the party a magic potion that will protect them from a curse that the antagonist has placed on the next dungeon. When a character asks if he's allowed to do this, he replies that it's just a little nudge. Let's keep this between us. All right? Later on, he says it's against his code to break into Aphorol's workshop. But he's allowed to use the guy's tools after you break in for him? He's not here. Why not bust the door down the same way you gave us the potion? Which of your cute technicalities are meant to be binding? At one point in the game, when the party splits up, Resh'an asks, "What about me?" To which Garl says, "Well, I assumed you weren't allowed to help." Even the rest of the party is confused about what he is and isn't allowed to do. Weirdest of all is Resh'an's insistence that he not be involved in direct combat with a dweller. He even goes so far as to sit on the sidelines as the party fights the Dweller of Strife. Frustrated by his lack of input, Seraï grabs his hourglass and throws it at the Dweller. Although not used by him, the very act of his weapon striking a Dweller is enough to summon the Big Bad, who shows up and takes a character's life in direct retribution. And yet, just a few hours later, Resh'an has absolutely no qualms about directly attacking a different Dweller. Back it up, my man. Do you have a strict code or not? Beast is the robo-analog, a big bulky bruiser who, for some reason, makes robot noises when he talks. Originally hailing from Serai's post-apocalyptic world. Visually, Beast has a great design. He's housed inside something called living glass, and his unique situational animations are really cool. He even makes use of this robust physical form just like Robo, to perform a task that only his body can, and then be discovered in the future, cleaned up, and added back to the party. He joins late in the game, and we don't learn much about him other than he's older than Resh'an. But because he joined so late, I guess his lack of character development doesn't feel that unnatural. Garl is Valere Zale's best friend, a normal kid from Mooncradle who hangs out and cooks for them. In fairness, he's the only party member who seems to be passionate about something other than saving the world. He introduces the cooking mechanic to the player and gets excited when he thinks he might find a new ingredient or cooking technique on the journey. But it's Garl's passion, I feel, that undoes the character. He is possessed of a toxic positivity that pervades his every interaction. Garl is the personification of telling someone with depression, "Well, gee whiz, what if you just tried being happy?" Because that's how he solves most problems facing the party, with a good vibes only speech. I consider myself to be a generally positive person, and Garl didn't bug me at first. It's not that his approach is necessarily wrong in all cases, it's the unrelenting one-dimensional delivery system, coupled with the fact that everyone immediately agrees and thinks he's just the bestest boy in the whole wide world for suggesting that they smile more. Garl is why Larry David throttled Elmo. For reasons I was never able to fully understand, he is worshipped and admired by everyone with whom he comes in contact. When the port town of Brisk is destroyed and the displaced townspeople have to migrate north to start a new settlement, everyone wants Garl to name the village because he was nice to them. And because positivity is his only trait, he names it Mirth. The townspeople, as well as Valere Zale, cannot hold back their adulation at this stroke of genius. Leave it to Garl! Seriously, how does he do it? Yeah. Even Beast, after knowing Garl for 8 seconds, is forced to say, "Haha, I like this guy!" Beast, blink if you're under duress. Eventually, we find out that Garl is the Chosen One, who receives prophetic visions from the Elder Mist that allow him to speak with the Sky Kingdom Council, who are unanimously receptive to his ideas. His whole plan to win the Sky People's trust is to wake a giant serpent called the Sleeper by baking it bread. He already has a plan to do this, and it's perfect. It came to him because he's the Chosen One. When the giant cloud people for whom he is performing this miracle point out that the Great Serpent would destroy the entire world if awakened, he replies, "No one can be grumpy if they wake up to bread." And gosh darn it, with the help of his friends, Garl bakes the world's biggest bread and awakens the Great Serpent. Let me see if I'm understanding this. The Great Serpent must remain asleep or it will awaken and destroy the world, but it smelled bread and now it simps for Garl. Please name me. Why do people want Garl to name things? Because Garl is treated as infallible and incorruptible by everyone, the game's world feels as if it's full of plants or paid hype people who received $20 to love Garl for an afternoon. Attention, Pittsburgh! The Garl Street Team is coming to your town! Imagine watching Chrono disintegrate and then having Garl pop up and say, "Whoa, don't look so down, everyone. Soup fixes everything." So when it inevitably came time for Sea of Stars to mimic this heroic sacrifice, I have to admit I was kind of relieved that it was Garl who stepped up to take the bullet. The game then grinds to a halt for a prolonged funeral sequence in which people from all over the world gather to mourn Garl. Chrono just got a couple sentences and a music box before the other characters shook it off and went to revive him. Chrono was a cipher, but he was mourned as such, and it soon made plain to the player that, nah, you're getting your boy back. So when Sea of Stars pulled out all the stops and showed me beautiful hand-drawn frames from the funeral, I thought, oh, wow, huh, I guess this is for real. Damn, good on you, Sea of Stars. Certainly, reviving Garl would be a waste, a meaningless decision that would walk back the character's sacrifice. I know that you know where this is going. You've got to do a bunch of side quests to revive Garl to get the true ending. An ending, by the way, where the only difference besides a different boss is that Garl is there. The big bad still quietly slips out the door like he just threw up at a party. Resurrection in games is always a contentious topic, but I like the way Suikoden does this by having the player fulfill certain requirements throughout the game to recruit everyone and earn the revival, rather than toss in a post-game quest you can do anytime. Unless you go in following a 108 stars guide, your first playthrough of the game is going to irrevocably end with a dead Gremio. You've lived the reality where it didn't work out, and on your second run you're ready and able to save the guy. Gremio's relationship with Young Master and the rest of the main cast was endearing, and even if I didn't use him in battle that much, I still appreciated having the character around, and even enjoyed seeing him in the sequel. You can't mourn a one-dimensional character. Remember when Mr. Peanut died? Remember what it did to us? Characters' actions and motivations don't entirely feel like they were thought through, or at the very least, don't feel credibly established. The biggest offenders here are Valere and Zale's mentors, Erlina and Brugaves, who betray the group partway through the game. But the motivation for this betrayal is half-hearted and inconsistent. They eventually side with the enemy, at first seemingly because they believe it will end the ancient cycle of pain and struggle that Solstice warriors are born into, a cycle that they themselves found rigorous. Let's set the stage for the big betrayal. The two mentors meet up with the protagonists and their headmaster in a haunted house to take out what they think is the last remaining dweller. Before they can destroy the dweller's core, however, Erlina and Brugaves usher in these 4 acolytes of the Fleshmancer and help them to resurrect an even stronger dweller. Brugaves then asks the kids, "Have you ever wondered what it would feel like for your life to be your own?" Erlina follows up with, "Don't you see that absolutely none of this endless conflict is your fault?" The intended framing of this betrayal is undeniably clear. Our order is fundamentally flawed, and it's time we found a better way. And up to this point, this is a credible motivation. There's a scene earlier in the game as Valere and Zale begin their training, in which the two mentors confront the headmaster, questioning the need to train more Solstice warriors. Soon after, as the kids set out on their journey, the two mentors remark to each other, "I still can't believe he wants them fighting a dweller already. We weren't much older the first time." "Yeah, but we'll find a way." They're clearly concerned because they know what their order puts children through in order to produce warriors, and they're not happy about it. Later on, we see flashbacks of their own training, in which Erlina snaps at the headmaster after Moraine admonishes Brugaves' lack of speed. So when their betrayal came, the motivation was plausible, and the new mystery generated by this betrayal was, wow, I can't wait to see how helping the big bad is going to further their goal of ending this cycle and freeing future generations. And you want to know what their answer to that is? So do I. Because this doesn't quite jive with their motivations as laid out by the remainder of the game. It's revealed that the Acolytes told them about an enormous dweller sleeping under a mountain that will eventually emerge and destroy the world. Rather than put themselves through this, they strike a deal with the villains to be spared and let everyone on the planet die in a fiery apocalypse in exchange for their help. The Acolytes also play to the mentors' desires by promising them gifts to sweeten the deal. Erlina desires immense power, while Brugaves wants super speed and to have his traumatic memories erased. Side note, if a character is willing to betray people on a planet-ending scale in exchange for super speed, maybe the impetus for that betrayal should be that he was too slow to save someone's life or something, not that he got yelled at during speed training one time. If this feels flimsy, it's because it was only included to connect the game to the messenger, where Brugaves shows up as a fast goat. I understand how these characters' desires are tempting to use as motivation, but they're incompatible with their established goals of protecting future generations of kids. If you're going to use these selfish ambitions, lean into them and stop pretending that you give a shit about anyone else in this room, because I'm not buying it. No, these kids should be free. To do what? Burn to death on their own schedule? What are you talking about? But I made a deal so the kids can come with me. Why would you assume they would want to immediately after being betrayed by the mentors they look up to, you colossal butthole? The story can't decide which motivation to go with for these characters, so instead of having one strong one, they have two weak, conflicting ones. Instead of this betrayal scene generating intrigue and a potential payoff, it presents concerns that just get brushed aside later when the writer thought of something more dramatic. What makes these motivations worse is that they require the mentors to conveniently stop believing in a prophecy that says everything will be fine. Every member of this order knows about the prophecy of Luana and Solon, the solstice gods that are said to one day return in the form of solstice warriors to save the world. These gods eat dwellers for lunch, but it's been centuries since they showed up. The mentors, despite previously acknowledging that the kids are abnormally strong, just assume that they aren't going to ascend and decide to bin humanity to save their own asses. Hey, guess what happens later? This is why none of this is credible. The altruism that's meant to prop up these characters and give them depth doesn't hold up if you choose to sacrifice an entire fucking planet. Even the flashbacks I mentioned earlier drop the ball in terms of generating sympathy for these two. At one point, we're shown the aftermath of the horrible battle with a dweller from years ago and how it impacted Mooncradle. Over 20 solstice warriors died. Who, though? We know of 3 who died, and of them only one was given a name. Who are these twins Moraine keeps mentioning? Who are the other 17+ warriors that no one seems to remember the names of? Where are their epitaphs in Mooncradle? Behind Garl's grave, maybe? This is a chance to establish your stakes, to show the warriors on the front line who died for this cause that the mentors condemn. You've told us about this heroic order of warriors that got wiped out and broke Moraine spiritually and mentally. But if you treat them as an afterthought, how important could they have been? Sea of Stars has a thing for prophecy, with clairvoyant elders spelling out future events in the game no fewer than 4 times. This differs from many of the classic JRPGs, in which prophecy typically takes the form of a legend that has been passed down. Games like the original Final Fantasy FF4 and Secret of Mana use some variation of, when things look bad, a hero will appear, as a means of emphasizing the protagonist's special status and reinforcing their fairy tale nature. Sea of Stars, by comparison, routinely doles out individualized summaries of future events to the party. This in itself isn't bad, but as usual, the game misunderstands what makes this interesting. Early on, the Elder Mist tells Zale that he must stare at the night inside of himself to reach his full potential. This is to foreshadow that he will learn how to go Super Saiyan after Garl dies. But so does Valere. Why is this prophecy unique to Zale? Is Zale closer to Garl? The Elder Mist then tells Valere that she will create paths on water, which turns out to be a very literal prophecy as we see her later creating a bridge out of water to get the party to a previously inaccessible island. But before that, she gets a prophecy remix from the Dokari Elder, who tells her she will mend the connection, referring to the same water bridge. Quite impressive. How did you know? Because 2 elders told me it would happen? Mend the connection? It's just literal! My issue here is that Sea of Stars uses prophecy as little more than basic foreshadowing, and not to any dramatic or ironic effect. In the future, you will do this. Or, when X happens, make sure you do Y. Prophecy as a narrative tool has the power to draw out character motivation and depth, putting characters in situations where they may seek to fulfill or avoid them. They can be used to explore concepts such as fatalism and free will, ideas that Sea of Stars pokes at but ultimately shrinks away from. Prophetic visions of tragedy can create tension or unease in a group. Look at Janice's omen in Chrono Trigger. One among you will shortly perish. It's vague and upsetting, especially coming from a little kid with a cat. Prophecy thrives on uncertainty and ambiguity. There's nothing compelling about straightforward prophecy. You'll make a bridge out of water and connect 2 points. What could it mean? But by far the worst offender is the Dokari Elder's prophecy of failure. He tells the party with absolute certainty that there is no possible outcome in which Valere and Zale can defeat the Dweller of Strife. But what at first sounds like certain doom actually turns out to be certain dumb. Before the Dweller can kill you, the big bad shows up and sends it through a portal because Seraï threw Resh'an's hourglass at it, which is a big no-no in their fun little feud. So what happens to it after that? That's a great question. The answer to which Sea of Stars fans are still in disagreement. Some think it and the 4 acolytes were fused into the World Eater that Valere and Zale face after the final boss in a shooting minigame set piece, most likely because this boss shows up with zero introduction or build-up, yet the characters act like they knew about it all along. Others think they fused into the Demon King from The Messenger, which makes sense visually, but within the narrative context of Sea of Stars is flaccid and unsatisfying. Either way, nothing is properly explained or followed up on. A prophecy that should have fueled mystery and served to set up a juicy late-game reveal is instead left to die on the table. Sure, it's technically true, but sweeping the monster under the rug to make it so isn't a satisfying conclusion. Imagine if the Elder knew the rest of the events. You're not gonna beat the villain's nightmare monster. Oh no, why? 'Cause it, walks away. Sabotage says that Sea of Stars is a prequel that takes place in the universe of The Messenger. I like continuity in connected worlds. I truly fell in love with Dragon Quest III when I realized it was a prequel to 1. But the decision to jam these 2 games together is one I don't fully understand. The Messenger is a fun, well-built throwback platformer marred only by what I consider to be an abundance of flat, cringy writing. Creating a reverent, heartfelt, 30-hour RPG lead-up to this is, frankly, bizarre. The tonal gulf between the two is so vast that any implied connection feels perfunctory, like connection for connection's sake. Imagine Peter Jackson in 2001 announcing that Fellowship of the Ring is a prequel to Bad Taste. Okay? A shared universe full of little details might be a fun thing to hint at after a few games of subtle clues, but proudly announcing in the game's Kickstarter that it takes place before The Messenger is meaningless. So why bring this up here? Well, in service of this continuity, Sea of Stars shoehorns ham-handed setups into the main plot every so often, typically in a way that makes them seem important to the story at hand, when in reality they're serving to set up connections and Easter eggs in a game you may not even play. And these aren't just limited to minor elements, but include entire character resolutions. Once I caught on that the game was doing this, I rapidly lost interest in its remaining plot threads. If I had to boil it down, I would describe Sea of Stars as misguided. The game wanders from gorgeous set piece to gorgeous set piece in the hopes that one of them will make you feel something. And they could have, if more care was given to telling an equally compelling story. Chrono Trigger isn't necessarily about heroism or time-traveling adventures. It's about resolve in the face of sadness and loneliness. It's about bleak desolation. It's about facing your own mortality. Remember when Balthazar's vessel asks to be switched off, effectively euthanizing him? It made me sad and a little uncomfortable as a kid, but replaying the game as a tired adult who's come out the other side of depression, I just thought, yeah dude, you're exhausted, and I get it. The fate of this ancillary character hit me harder than anything in Sea of Stars, a game that is only concerned with replicating the surface-level cool fun 90s retro veneer of Chrono Trigger and its contemporaries. Because at its heart, Sea of Stars isn't really about anything. It's a good versus evil story that plays out by the book until the end, when evil sheepishly slinks through a portal. Aside from becoming Super Saiyans, our heroes haven't grown or changed in any demonstrable way. The game starts to sow seeds of doubt in their minds about their order and their purpose, then it digs those seeds up and throws them away. In a sense, this is the only thing the game does to subvert genre tropes. It sets up an order of warriors that robs children of their childhoods to relentlessly train them for battle with horrible abominations, then tells us unequivocally that this order is good and just. It may be tempting to say that, given their success, these games are standing on the shoulders of giants. But after playing through both of them, it feels more accurate to say that they're gazing longingly up at those giants and saying, "Me want uppies." They lean heavily on the cultural currency of classic JRPGs, relying on popular and identifiable frameworks to do most of the heavy lifting for them. Sometimes that's fine, when an author knows how to be subtle about their influences or creative in their implementation, or even just has something to add. Ultimately, my criticism here is of the love letter school of game design, a surging trend of which these 2 games are by no means the only offenders. Chained Echoes is weakened by pervasive, unceasing homage that obstructs any effort to take the story or characters at face value. Sea of Stars never fully knows or commits to what kind of world or story it would show us, and instead tries to skate by on vibes, which, for many people, is enough. Both games have original elements that don't or can't do enough to pull themselves from the shadow of the things they worship. I didn't make this video just to be critical. I made it because I really wanted to like both of these games, and I went into them with that mindset. So what is it exactly that they're missing? In his book, Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud lays out the creative process as a sequence of 6 steps: idea, form, idiom, structure, craft, and surface. Scott remarks that flashy new artists tend to copy the surface-level craft of the old masters without giving the same thought to what's underneath. Comics, like RPGs, must be built around a compelling tale. We know that these games nail that outermost layer, but a game is more than sights and sounds, and when the same amount of care isn't given to the ideas and composition that these things surround, the resulting experience is going to be hollow. I don't need or expect all games to be profound, earth-shaking works of genius, but I do expect all RPGs to have a handle on the basics of writing a story. Despite sometimes being difficult to understand and packed with distracting illusion, Chained Echoes comes closer to being a complete story than Sea of Stars. I mentioned up top that I consider it to have the better plot and characters of the two, and I really believe this. I disagree with Matthias's execution in many ways, but it still felt like a whole, deliberate narrative experience. He chose not to hire a proper editor, and as a result, the game stumbles when it comes to structure and craft, but there are definitely ideas in there worth entertaining. Sea of Stars, on the other hand, when asked what its ideas and purpose are, just shrugs. After the credits rolled and Valere and Zale had returned peace to their world, I was left with one unanswered question for Sabotage. What do you think it is about Chrono Trigger that people like? I can't answer that question for you, but if you believe that video games are art and deserve to be treated as such, this is the kind of homework that has to go into step 1 of your creative process, which, according to Scott, includes the impulses, ideas, emotions, philosophies, and purposes of the work's content. Decide what your game is saying, and if the answer is, I like Chrono Trigger, start over. Your premise doesn't need to be super deep or complex to be art, it just needs some kind of genuine substance. Establish themes and be consistent with them. Be focused and thoughtful in how you shape your characters. Give them well-considered motivations and goals. Give them interests and preferences and rich personalities. When you skip these steps, you're skipping the foundational elements of writing and hoping the audience won't notice. Because make no mistake, writing is an art. Things like dialogue, plot structure, characterization, everything down to word choice, spelling, and grammar are all important parts of this artistic process, no less important than the graphics or music. In fact, indie devs should approach writing the same way as those other elements. If you can't do it, you hire a professional who can. It's simplistic and naive to point to the classics and say, I'll just do that. Every step of the way, Undertale is crystal clear about what it is and what it does. It's got the sincere emotional core of the Mother games, but doesn't expend time or energy trying to activate the reference center of the brain. Instead, it subverts expectations to create a unique experience that still houses Toby Fox's love for the Mother series without veering into pure mimicry. How do you do something like this? In a 2015 Camp Fangamer interview, Toby talks about the qualities of each Mother game that inspired his work.
I tried to take elements of from every single Mother game. I wanted the sad stuff from Mother 3, I wanted the goofy fun stuff from Earthbound, and I wanted the weird mysteriousness that Mother has.
Undertale doesn't just copy key elements. Toby zeroed in on the emotional frequencies of the Mother series, then resonated at those frequencies in his own style, to tell a story that feels satisfying in its execution. Everything about Undertale's world is meaningful to him, and the player feels that. To me, that's what inspiration and purpose are about. Not how closely can I copy superficial aspects, or here's a list of games I like. Understand that Toby got the mimicry out of his system when he was a child. While not strictly an RPG, another good one that gets it right is Tunic. It recaptures the mystery of playing games as a kid, when you might not understand everything the manual or even the game world's inhabitants are telling you. It's subtle and indirect, but it's a lot more powerful than empty referential set dressing. In fact, I was late to check out Tunic because I wrongly assumed it was just furry Zelda, based purely on the visual style. It's certainly influenced by and reverent of Zelda, but it goes much further than just homage. It's great at eliciting the kinds of thoughts, feelings, and emotions that are unique to this medium. Because this is a unique medium. Video games have the power to move us in ways that other media can't. But the ones that do are focused and deliberate. They do the homework. Anyone interested in designing an RPG should play both of these games. There's a lot to learn from them, and as games, they do more right than wrong. But the things they do botch are, unfortunately, crucial to storytelling in the genre they've chosen. I understand story isn't important to everyone. Sometimes we stick with a lackluster narrative because we like the underlying systems that comprise the gameplay. Conversely, sometimes we stick with bad systems because we like the characters and their attitudes and want to see where the story takes them. As long as you're having fun, that's all that matters. Thank you for watching this bloated opinion piece. Videos like this are only possible thanks to viewer support on Patreon. If you like this video and want early access to future ones, please consider donating at the $5 level. You can find out more at patreon.com/Patui.